Edgar Wright films have a stylistic identity. The director behind Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Baby Driver, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is renowned for making films that engage the viewer's visual and auditory senses. Through various color palettes and musical cues, his movies have a unique stylistic pop. And whether we are discussing his films' gorgeous cinematography, their catchy soundtracks, the clever scripts, or the detail-rich narratives, Wright's movies have a distinct personality. They all have flair. This is admittedly why I was excited to see Wright's take on the horror genre with Last Night in Soho, which is Wright's latest film. See, as a director, Wright mostly makes action movies and comedies, but Last Night in Soho sees the director venturing into uncharted territory, most notably because Last Night in Soho is Wright's first horror film, which is notable in and of itself. After all, it is a new foray and a creative experiment into a genre that is creatively alien to Wright's usual brand of film. And while his prior films do blur genres, the fact still remains that a feature-length focus on horror is altogether different for the director. It is new ground for him. Thankfully, Wright's venture into the horror genre works with Last Night in Soho. The movie sees Wright using his clearly identifiable style in order to create a horror film that is thrilling and filled with visually stimulating cinematography that is complemented by the usage of auditory cues. And with that, the movie is engaging. Whether we are discussing the great soundtrack, shot composition, or the clever narrative structure, Last Night in Soho is an impressively well put together film, and adds some fun performances by Thomasin McKenzie and Anya Taylor-Joy, and this is a fun time at the movies. It is quite good. The Last Night in Soho's positive qualities start with its story. The plot follows Eloise, a socially awkward young woman from England's countryside who moves to the bustling city of London in order to study fashion design at the London College of Fashion, well named. Once there, Eloise immediately runs afoul of the popular girls' clique, the head of which is her roommate in the mean girl Jocasta, who is a really shitty person, and due to a rocky relationship between the two, Eloise moves into an apartment to live the solo life. Events get interesting from there. See, Eloise has a sixth sense where she can see spirits of the deceased, and as soon as she moves into the new apartment, she has visions of the 1960s and sees the life of aspiring singer Sandy, who is a cool and confident woman that Eloise wants to imitate. And with that, these time-traveling visions involving the glamorous Sandy in the swinging 60s seem cool to Eloise at first glance. After all, she loves 60s era fashion and pop culture, but Eloise's opinion of these visions goes downhill fast as she begins to realize that something truly horrible happened to Sandy, something so terrible that these visions begin to haunt Eloise's daily life. And due to this, our heroine must solve the mystery of what happened to Sandy, because that is ultimately the only way that Eloise will be able to find peace from these distressing visions. Last Night in Soho's story is overall really good, mostly because it covers a lot of ground thematically. For one thing, it is an interesting Metoo era movie. The film covers a lot of themes regarding sexism and how misogynistic men view women's bodies as playgrounds for their penises. Whether we are discussing men trying to take advantage of or dismissing the socially awkward Eloise, or the sexual abuse that Sandy experiences back in the 1960s, there is a lot of sex discriminatory baggage in this film that our characters must combat and overcome. There is a lot of bullshit that these women must endure. The focus on sexual discrimination is a good narrative angle, given the last few years in real life where many women have come forth and detailed their various abusers. Last Night in Soho's themes regarding misogyny and sexism are very resonant. They fit in with society circa 2021, and as a result, the film feels very much in tune with our current moment in time as more women fight and detail their abusers in real life. Truly, the movie's art meets the reality here. Eloise's neurodivergent nature is another relatable narrative wrinkle here. Like many people on the autism spectrum or folks with mental health disabilities, Eloise can easily become overwhelmed with sensory overload. She can get anxious in big crowds, lose track of herself in the big city, desire to remain alone in the solitude of her bedroom, and she may even put on headphones in order to focus on music so that she can prevent her anxiety from spiraling out of control. And these are all things that neurodivergent people like myself can understand. After all, many of us know what it's like to be overwhelmed in social settings or in crowded public places, and from that point of view, we get where Eloise is coming from with her own social anxiety. We can relate because we have been there. She is kind of like one of us. Furthermore, Eloise's subsequent mental health breaks are understandable as well, as Eloise's visions regarding Sandy in the 1960s cross into horrifying territory as the film goes on, Eloise becomes haunted in everyday life. She begins to have horrific visions that overwhelm her to the point that she can't function in daily life, and even begins screaming in public. And speaking as someone who has had debilitating dissociative tendencies in the past, I connected with Eloise's struggle here, because I too have had episodes where I literally collapse at work and mumble words unintelligibly to people who aren't actually there. And with Eloise's struggle and Thomasin McKenzie's awesome performance, I really saw myself represented on screen. I felt seen. Admittedly, Last Night in Soho's positives go beyond the themes and representation though. In fact, the film works from a cinematic construction level as well. As stated earlier, Edgar Wright has a very distinct style, and in Last Night in Soho, he uses the coloring, cinematography, and audio cues to craft a film that is quite frightening. While the movie is for sure a slow burn at first, Edgar Wright uses music, various camera angles, and colors to tell a story that is quite unnerving at times. A story that is oddly enough very much like an inverse version of his comedies, where in movies like Hot Fuzz or Scott Pilgrim he'd use his trademark style to elicit laughs. Last Night in Soho sees him effectively flip his cinematic technique in order to elicit scares. In fact, the camera lingers more, the visuals can be a bit more obscured, the coloring is more sinister, and there are some shockingly well-placed scares. It's quite well done, to be honest. Last Night in Soho's good script further complements these thriller uniquities. Co-written by Edgar Wright and Krysty Wilson-Cairns, the movie has wit, but with a sinister edge. In Wright's past work, a lot of characters would have throwaway gag lines that are meant to be funny, but in Last Night in Soho, the dialogue has a certain menace, kind of like Mr. Skinner's lines in Hot Fuzz, but made into a whole movie. And with that, a lot of the dialogue in Last Night in Soho is heavy with foreshadowing and potential double meanings, and because of this, the movie's sharp script keeps the viewer on their toes. It is quite unnerving. The movie is unpredictable from a narrative standpoint as well. In fact, the movie's script is so good that it's difficult to predict where the plot is potentially heading, because while you might have some inkling as to where Last Night in Soho is going, rest assured, you don't. And admittedly, I can't really say anything more without going into spoilers, but let me just say I was impressed with where the story went. It did a good job. Admittedly, Last Night in Soho does have a few problems. For one thing, the first time the movie transitions to the 1960s is a bit abrupt in terms of how our experience with Eloise's ability to connect with deceased spirits is minimal. While we do see her connect with a certain spirit earlier on in the film for a few seconds as if it were The Shining, that doesn't exactly prepare us for when Eloise sees a full-blown vision of the 1960s when she first sees Sandy. The movie just kind of drops us in the narrative deep end here and expects us to swim. And while that aforementioned swim is very much worth it, it is still kind of a big thing to drop on the audience with little to no warning. Furthermore, Last Night in Soho is very much a slow burn. In fact, the first half of the movie is slow to the point that it isn't all that scary, to be perfectly honest. But to the film's credit, it does build a sense of tension over time, and it does become notably disturbing at moments in the second half as it weaves an ultimately satisfying narrative. And that is honestly my thought on Last Night in Soho. The movie is very much worth your time. It is an incredibly well put together film, has terrific performances, a tight script, beautiful yet haunting cinematography, awesome direction by Edgar Wright, and it is very relatable to both neurodivergent people and women who have experienced sexism in some form. And with that, there are truly a lot of good reasons to see this movie, because honestly, despite its nightmarish nature, Last Night in Soho is truly a dream. See ya. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, subscribe, ring the bell, share, and leave a comment telling me what you thought about this film or horror movies in general. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones, and David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.